Good evening, everyone. My name is Atif, and I am the moderator tonight, this evening. I would like to welcome and thank you all for being here today. Before we start our discussion, I would like to say a few words about ALHEWAR Center for those who don't understand Arabic. ALHEWAR, the word ALHEWAR means dialogue. ALHEWAR Center was established in 1994 by Subhi al-Ghandour, by ALHEWAR magazine, as an independent forum for dialogue among the various members of the Arab American community. The goals include finding common ground within the community, as well as bringing about greater mutual understanding between the Arab community and the American society at large. ALHEWAR Center is not affiliated with any country, religion, organization, political party, or ideology. Rather, it provides a forum for respectful dialogue and is open to all viewpoints. Over the last 24 years, ALHEWAR Center has hosted 1,050 events about politics, economy, and culture in both English and Arabic. Today, we are happy to have Mr. Max Blumenthal with us. He will talk about the Palestinian issue and Trump's plans for the Middle East after the Israeli election. Then after the presentation, we will hear remarks by Mr. Mohammed, the Executive Director of the Palestine Center, who is also the co-sponsor of tonight's event. Also, Mr. Blumenthal recently published a new book, The Management of Savagery: How America's National Security State Fueled the Rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and guess who? Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Mr. Blumenthal will sign copies of his book, which will be available for sale after the discussion this evening. Max Blumenthal is an award-winning journalist and the author of several books, including best-selling Republican Goliath, The 51-Day War, and The Management of Savagery. He has produced print articles for an array of publications, many video reports, and several documentaries, including Killing Gaza. Mr. Blumenthal founded the Gray Zone Project in 2015 to shine a journalistic light on America's state of perpetual war and its dangerous domestic repercussions. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Mr. Max Blumenthal.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and and thank you to ALHEWAR for inviting me. I was also invited to do something in Chicago today for my book, but I wanted to be here with your community and to talk also not just about my book, but to talk about Palestine. And I've learned about the work you've been doing over the last decade. So this was definitely an audience I wanted to meet. And thanks for coming out tonight. I come to Vienna, Virginia about as often as I come to Vienna, Austria. So this is, it had to be important. And I'm glad you guys fought through the traffic as well. And I want to apologize for two things. First, that I wasn't able to get anyone to bring any books here. I have a small publisher, but the book is easily available online. It's called The Management of Savagery, and I'm going to do another event in Reston before the summer, so I would be happy to meet you there and sign the book, or I can send a digital signature. I have an e-signature. It's probably more legible than my real signature. And I apologize for being late. It was actually my fault. We were not on Arab time. It was the white Jewish guy whose fault it was. So don't blame Muhammad. I, have been noticing just since I came out with the book you mentioned, Goliath, in 2013. That book was about sort of a transitional period in Israel, starting with the 2009 elections when Netanyahu came back into the prime minister's office. And he is now going to be the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. He had just served the longest term of any prime minister. That Israel was in a transitional period at that point, is moving into permanent right-wing control. When I pointed out, after spending 5 years in and out of Israel-Palestine, especially living among, Jewish Israelis in central Jerusalem, that the reporting that I was relaying back to the U.S. was getting attacked heavily by liberal Zionists, by people who believe that you can be a liberal and a Zionist. You can believe in kind of multiculturalism here and Zionism over there, which is essentially Jewish supremacism, putting one ethno-religious group above all others, and still saying it's Jewish and democratic. You can do that. It's like you can say I'm a promiscuous virgin. It's just it's a contradiction that you can't really square. So they were very upset because I was showing that this liberal Zionist fantasy had exploded. Netanyahu was in charge. There was never going to be peace in the way that they spelled it, and that the way they understood it, which is a two-state solution with a non-Palestinian state. Actually, in his final address at the Knesset, Yitzhak Rabin said, we will have less than a state for Palestinians. But there would be peace. There would be peace after peace after peace being taken by the settlers until there was annexation, which we now see is right on Netanyahu's agenda and is very popular among Jewish Israelis. I was talking about Jewish Israelis becoming very racist, that the younger generation, the youth that I saw outside my doorstep, who were attacking Palestinian workers often who would come through Jerusalem, were more racist than their parents and grandparents. That Israeli Democratic Institute polls showed that over 50% of Jewish Israeli youth would declare their refusal to live next door to an Arab or a non-Jew from Africa, for example. That over 50% of the Israeli public consistently favored annexation and expulsion of Palestinian citizens of Israel, which has been on the agenda of figures like Avigdor Lieberman, who apparently is going to come back into the defense ministry. And so that book came under harsh attack from liberal Zionists. Today, that narrative in that book, it's almost like I felt like I went soft. It's almost like I went too easy, but I was just reporting the facts. And now everyone understands that liberal Zionism is dead. The Labor Party is gone. And Netanyahu is King Bibi. He is the true face of Israel. In many ways, he's in the center. So I saw a tweet today by AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's the very popular, hip face of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. She says she's a socialist. I don't know if she knows what that means, but it's a cool label to put on yourself these days, which is a good thing. And she's actually starting to get a little bit educated on Palestine. She has agreed to support Betsy McCollum's really important bill on child detention, which withholds U.S. aid to Israel over the detention of Palestinian children. This is something you rarely hear from Democrats who are upset about children being detained on the U.S.-Mexico border, but not children being detained with our tax dollars in occupied territory. So Betsy McCollum from Minnesota introduced this important bill, and AOC is now defending it, which will give it more of a high profile in Washington and nationally. But she defended it in an interesting way by saying that she opposes authoritarianism, Netanyahu's authoritarianism. And the problem in Israel-Palestine isn't authoritarianism. It isn't that, he's this right-wing dictator or something. The problem, as all Palestinians understand, is apartheid. It's another A word. And apartheid didn't start under Netanyahu. And that's what we need to make people understand. It officially started in 1948. A lot of people don't understand that there was a military occupation from 1948 to 1966 under the Labor Party of David Ben-Gurion. They don't understand that there were massacres like Kfar Qasem in 1956 when farmers were coming home and they got home to they left the fields too late, they got dark, and they were violating a curfew under this military occupation during the '56 war, when Israel was acting as in its traditional role as a handmaiden of empire. And they were gunned down and massacred. And David Ben-Gurion imposed a cordon around the town of Kfar Qasem to keep all reporters out. And it was thanks to, I believe, Tufik Tubi and Meyer Vilner, excuse me, I mean, I just remembered that. I'm amazed that I even got his first name right. Meyer, so you know this history.
I know the two guys you just mentioned
You know
very well.
personally.
Yeah.
Amazing. I mean, I'm speaking to some veterans here, so maybe this is all, superfluous. From the Communist Party. The Communist Party of Israel was the first party to bring together Palestinians and Jews to fight for common cause. And they snuck into the town and discovered the facts and met the survivors in their hospital beds and got this information out, that Israel had just massacred farmers for violating the occupation, and these farmers were technically citizens of Israel. This is a history that's been totally forgotten, and it seems like it always goes down the memory hole that the Labor Party has been the most violent party towards Palestinians, and that the worst wars and the worst assaults on the region, from Lebanon to Syria to Egypt, have been conducted under the watch of Israel's Labor Party. And so we had a really interesting election just now in Israel, where the Labor Party is now so irrelevant that it cannot actually enter the Knesset, I believe, without entering into a coalition with another irrelevant party, which is the left Zionist Meretz Party, the Israeli version of the Green Party. And so what happened was the opposition all got together against Netanyahu, and they formed the Blue and White Party. And I know in their hearts that the liberal Zionists who attacked my book, Goliath, were pulling for the Blue and White Party. And I know that the editorial board at the New York Times and the Washington Post was pulling for the Blue and White Party. But who was the Blue and White Party? Blue and White Party was headed by Benny Gantz. And in January, Benny Gantz introduced his opening message to the Israeli public of what he was going to do and what record he was going to run on. And it was a commercial that showed drone footage of Shujaiya, which was the neighborhood and the area east of Gaza City, which I visited multiple times, and which features in my documentary with Dan Cohen, Killing Gaza, that had been destroyed by Israeli howitzers, where people were massacred at the market in July 2014, where they were bombed with F-16s, where virtually every house was totally destroyed, and where the Palestinian resistance put up the fiercest fight in history and actually dealt Israel a severe bloody nose. And Benny Gantz declared that he starts rattling off statistics in this ad of how many were killed in Gaza under his watch as the Israeli Army Chief of Staff. He calls them terrorists, but we know that 551 women and children were among that 2,100 or so that were killed, and many more non-combatants. But he called them all terrorists, and he bragged about how many skulls and skeletons he left behind in Gaza, and how many shattered homes he left behind. This was the opposition in Israel, along with two other generals, Moshe Ya'alon and Gabi Ashkenazi, who were up to their eyeballs in blood. And then you had, what's his name, Yair Lapid, who was spent much of his life in a studio in Hollywood, and he was like this LA guy who came back and tried to inherit the mantle of his father's party, which represents nothing other than the hatred of Orthodox Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel. So that's the opposition. The blue and white, which should really be called the red and red for all the blood they've spilled, versus Benjamin Netanyahu, who was so worried that he would lose his coalition that he entered into a coalition with Otzma Yehudit, which is Jewish Power, a party inspired by Meir Kahane.
Greatness.
Yeah, great, Jewish greatness, okay. This is my fact checker.
That's okay. It's just because it really shows you
That
how
matters.
racist it is.
Yeah.
It's not greatness, it's...
I appreciate it. It's basically saying Jewish supremacy.
Yes.
Jewish superiority, and they're involved with a group called the Temple Movement, which aims to destroy the Al-Aqsa compound and replace it with the Third Temple. They're messianic apocalypticists. They have connections with literal terrorists in Kiryat Arba and the hardcore settlements in the West Bank. I followed them actually in Tel Aviv, and you can see it in a YouTube video I produced with my friend David Sheen called Israel's New Racism, where they would go on these little pogroms against the African asylum seekers in Tel Aviv, and just when I was following them, they were marching through the streets, and they surrounded a pregnant African woman and just started screaming at her, "Get the hell out of my country! Get the hell out of my country!" And I said, "This guy has a Russian accent. What country are you talking about? It's yours." So they're Kahanists. And we all know who Meir Kahana was. He advocated the genocide of Palestinians, the full expulsion of Palestinians. And he actually made the argument that I made at the beginning, which none of us can deny, which is that you cannot have a Jewish and democratic state. And so I say have a democratic state. Meir Kahana said have a fascist state. He wants to resolve the contradictions in that way. So these are Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition partners. Mikhail Ben-Ari is the leader of this party. He ripped up a Quran on the floor of the Knesset. These are the lunatics. I mean, I can say this. They're basically the Ku Klux Klan. And these are Netanyahu's coalition partners. So you have Bibi and the Klan versus the Red and Red Party, and Bibi and the Klan wins. Netanyahu this is his coronation. He is the true face of Israel. And this actually is something that, in a way, I wouldn't say we should celebrate, but we should accept it. We shouldn't be so upset about it, because for two reasons. Number one, I think that it was much more likely that under the watch of someone like Benny Gantz, who's very worried about a right-wing public that doesn't respect him, that he would launch a brutal assault like Ehud Barak, the former leader of the Labor Party, would consistently do against Lebanon and the Gaza Strip to demonstrate his street credentials. These are generals. This is what they do in Israel to show the public that they're with him. Number two, Benjamin Netanyahu, while he personally was dragged into the 2014 assault on the Gaza Strip by the street, has been much more cautious than many of his predecessors, particularly in the Labor Party, about these massive military attacks. Because he understands that the Israeli public is afraid of losing young men. It's a small society, it's a tribalistic society, everybody knows each other. And when if you remember the first Lebanon war, this was one of the rare times Israel had a peace movement. It was a peace movement basically to get this out of Lebanon. Started by 4 mothers of 4 combatants who had been killed. And it was because Israel can't take casualties. It's just a small society. And so that's when Israel started introducing drone technology and robotics. They're actually going to start introducing drone checkpoints to avoid losing men so that it can make war more possible. But Netanyahu saw what happened in 2014 when losing 35 soldiers in Shujaiya caused almost a political earthquake at home. He doesn't want to do it again. That's part of the secret to his success, is avoiding these giant and he also understands that Hezbollah, out of the Syrian conflict, now has offensive forward capacity. They have serious deterrent capacity, and that Israel would pay a heavy price for assaulting southern Lebanon. So there's that, but there's also the work that we're doing here, where you can just see, if you look at the opinion polls of American Jews, Netanyahu and the forces he represents are so repellent to American Jews, and they're so repellent to American progressives in general, that they're beginning to see Israel for what it always has been, which is as an apartheid state that fosters racism among its citizens through universal conscription, occupation, and settler colonialism. They're starting to see what all of you have always known. And so in many ways, Netanyahu is the teacher who will defy any American president who tries to withhold his settler colonial drive. And I always say that Zionism's like a shark. If it stops moving forward, it dies. That's actually a line from Annie Hall. It's a Woody Allen movie. He said that about relationships. If they stop moving forward, they die. Zionism has to maintain its dynamism. It has to consistently colonize. It has to keep moving people outwards, because if it maintains stasis, the contradictions start to come out. The contradictions of the fact that there are Arab Jews whose grandparents spoke Arabic, who are very poor and who are being discriminated against by an Ashkenazi elite. That there are Russian Jews, many of whom are not receiving adequate benefits because, for example, their mother might not have actually been Jewish, and the rabbinate decides that they're not Jewish at all. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews who are non-Zionist, and they do not want to participate in the army and are holding gigantic protests and being beaten in the streets by Israeli Magavnikim, by the border police. These are amazing scenes, by the way, to see Orthodox Jews being beaten by Israeli police. You have all these contradictions, and then you have one of the worst records of inequality in the OECD, in the European Economic Union. I don't know why they're in the European Economic Union. I don't know why they're in Eurovision. I don't know how that happened, but they're there. And that means it's very hard to go shopping for basic goods in Israel. Things are expensive. They had a huge protest back in 2011 over the price of cottage cheese. And so their version of social welfare is to send people into the West Bank, into these cheap settlements. And so then settler colonialism becomes a replacement for the socialism of the kibbutz movement. And they have to keep moving forward. And as soon as they're blocked, as soon as they're stopped, as soon as the spare parts stop coming for the F-15s, as soon as the Caterpillar D9 stop coming, as soon as these little pieces stop arriving, as soon as Betsy McCollum's bill on child detention is implemented, the shark stops moving. And so that's why it's so important for me to talk to you and for you to be continuing this work, because we have the ability to stop the shark through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And we can take inspiration from what's happening in Palestine, the little victories like the one that occurred yesterday, where Palestinian prisoners, after an 8-day hunger strike, actually succeeded and won most of their demands. They were not being able to make phone calls to the outside. They were being kept in humid little cells. Their cell phones there were blockage systems being put on their cell phones. Visitation was being limited. They went on a hunger strike and they won. There's resistance happening every week in Palestine, and we scarcely hear about it because I think it should inspire us to resist more and more. And of course, I think one of the greatest victories was the Great March of Return, which continues. And you see at these marches young men coming without legs, without arms, hobbling back to the border because they want out of their prison as well. They want their demands, they're prisoners, and they want their demands met. They did manage to get some of the salaries paid off. They did manage to get Qatar's, the money that Qatar had said it was going to pay back salaries of PA employees. They managed to get some heating oil in so that the electricity crisis, which I saw when I was there just over a year ago, has improved a little bit. And this is because of the sacrifice so many people made at the frontier, the militarized frontier of Gaza and what's known as Israel. And their sacrifice was not in vain. The United Nations has recommended that an investigation be undertaken into Israel's killing of medics, children, and journalists like Yasser Mertaja, as well as countless civilians and disabled people during the Great March of Return, and that that investigation be submitted to the International Criminal Court. So international law is bearing down on Israel, as it always does. Unfortunately, we're also witnessing some tragic developments. The Palestinian Authority has begun cutting off payments to families who have had members killed by Israel, specifically families that participated in the resistance in the Gaza Strip because they participated as parts of factions that are not Fatah, that are not part of the faction of Mahmoud Abbas. These payments are like $700 a month. They support entire families. It's what young people rely on to be able to pay for their college costs. And the tuition rates are actually going up. Rent's going up. And this is what happens. The Palestinian Authority is what happens when you give up resisting, as the Algerians refused to do, as Cuba refused to do, as Syria, when it faced the full wrath of the empire, refused to do. And you lose your sovereignty. And when you lose your sovereignty, you become a tool of the empire, and you're forced to sell your own people out, and they will eventually turn on you. It's another reason why the Palestinian diaspora is so important right now, because you're not represented in Ramallah. That's the whole point of the PA, is to divide Palestinians even further. And so that's what my book is about, The Management of Savagery. It's about assaults on countries that have resisted U.S. control, that have presented another vision. Palestinians have presented a vision of resistance for the whole world for decades and decades and decades. Cuba has presented another vision of a different economy that can provide the poorest with free healthcare and education and turn them into engineers and provide them with opportunities. And it has faced an embargo, a siege, much like the siege that the Gaza Strip faces, although obviously not quite as cruel. My book is about countries that have faced, it's about the US drive for regime change and how it uses regime change under the guise of humanitarianism, saving the children, in order to destroy and destabilize countries that resist its sphere of influence. And now we can look at the countries where it succeeded. We can look at Iraq, which has been stabilized, but which has seen so many not only die, but has seen sectarianism appear where none previously existed. And that sectarianism eventually took the form of the Islamic State. And we've seen Libya be shattered by NATO in order to supposedly save people, to protect civilians. The responsibility to protect was invoked by the Obama administration, R2P. The responsibility to protect is basically liberals being able to get in touch with their inner racist and bomb brown people in order to save them. And what is Libya now? Well, it's still at war. 8 years later, they're still in civil war. There are, according to even CNN, open-air slave auctions in Libya. And this is thanks to our first black president, Barack Obama, that slavery has returned to the continent of Africa. And it was destabilized deliberately because it was presenting a challenge for AFRICOM, which is the US archipelago of bases. It was destabilized also because Muammar Gaddafi, and you can say whatever you want about him, you can say he was crazy, but he was the first person in the New York Times to publish an op-ed calling for a single democratic state in Israel-Palestine, and he infuriated the Israel lobby. Have you noticed that the countries that the U.S. consistently targets for regime change are the same countries that were named in the clean break document written by neoconservatives for Benjamin Netanyahu the first time he entered the prime minister's office in 1996? They all seem to be countries that give Israel headaches. And so the next country on the neocon hit list, but it was everybody's hit list in Washington, was Syria. And you know, I got it wrong in the beginning on Syria. I was wrapped up in the fervor of the Arab Spring. I wanted, the people want to bring down the old regime. I wasn't looking clearly at what was going on. In many ways, I was told to listen to Syrian voices, and I wasn't listening to Syrian voices. The Qatar Foundation, which is run by Azmi Bashara, who is one of the people who actually convinced Qatar to get involved in pushing for regime change in Syria and funding wonderful freedom fighters like Jabhat al-Nusra, the local wing of al-Qaeda, did a poll of what Syrians wanted in 2012. And 55% of them preferred that Assad stay to the opposition, not because they thought Assad was this brilliant leader, but because they looked at what the opposition was and decided they didn't want to become Libya. And so Syria made a huge sacrifice. We don't talk about this, but even according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is funded by the British Foreign Office, which was essentially a publicity arm of the opposition, and it tracked casualties, close to 100,000 people have died on the government side. And many or most of those people were young men who were conscripted or who fought in order to prevent groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham and 31 colors of Takfiri who knows what from marching on Damascus. They fought to prevent black flags from flying over Damascus. And so we need to understand this is our legacy in Syria. This is the legacy of our country in Syria. And those in the Palestine Solidarity Movement who supported this, I mean, I turned around and looked at it clearly for what it was, and then I tried to expose the humanitarian sham that was trying to stimulate public support for another regime change war, destabilizing another country in the heart of the Middle East that I strongly believe would have led to the destabilization of Lebanon as well, and a full court assault press and assault on religious minorities across the Middle East. Those who went along with this in the Palestine Solidarity Movement and who signed a cowardly blacklist against me for my factual reporting have helped create space for Benjamin Netanyahu to declare that the Golan Heights is not part of Syria, because they declared that they rejected Syria's sovereignty by supporting this entire regime change operation. They implicitly stated their rejection of Syria's sovereignty as supposed supporters of Palestine solidarity, just as Benjamin Netanyahu has done by declaring that the Golan Heights, which is sovereign Syrian territory under international law, under every legal convention, is his. And so they essentially abandoned the ability of anyone to reject what Netanyahu is seeking to do in the Golan Heights. And we also know what is under the ground in the Golan Heights, which is a whole lot of natural gas, which Genie Energy wants. And they have connections to the Trump administration, if you look at who's on the board. Now, in many ways, I actually want to make a point about this all before I kind of wrap it up. But I want to make a point about, the theme of my book, which is about the U.S. and its allies among the Gulf monarchs, how they destabilized these countries. I mean, we know the Iraq invasion was just a direct invasion, but then there were semi-covert operations, starting in Afghanistan, going to Bosnia, to Chechnya, and then Libya, where we supported the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was a literal affiliate of Al-Qaeda. John McCain actually flew out there to meet with Abdel Hakim Belhaj and said, these people are not Al-Qaeda. They are our friends. They're freedom fighters, And then he went to the Syrian border and met with the same kind of characters. He literally met with figures who had just kidnapped Shia pilgrims, who were involved in human rights crimes, and said, I'll see you in Damascus, you're freedom fighters. And this was the so-called Free Syrian Army, started by the CIA, which turned into a weapons farm for Al-Qaeda and ISIS and basically disappeared. These are the mandarins of the national security state. These are the foreign policy elite in Washington. And it eventually fell to Trump to take up their policies. Donald Trump, who ran as the president who wanted to put in a Muslim ban, who ran on Islamophobia, who was really the first president to run in a full-on Islamophobic campaign. And Donald Trump, unlike Obama, demonstrated the willingness to bomb Syria. Donald Trump adopted a lot of the neocons and the liberal interventionist policies on Syria. And so it's worth remembering this when Donald Trump comes out and blames Ilhan Omar for 9/11 because she said in innocuous comments that some people did some things. It's a throwaway line. Or she said some people did something. And so what I do in my book, The Management of Savagery, as I talk about 9/11, I think we need to go into that history. And I talk about which people did which things to cause that event to be possible and to happen. And those people are the foreign policy elites in Washington who thought that it was worth arming the Mujahideen, and it was worth partnering with Saudi and Pakistani intelligence in order to help Osama bin Laden set up the services bureau on the Pakistani border, that it was worth arming all of these Salafi jihadi groups across the Middle East to achieve their goal of bringing down countries that resisted the US's control and that resisted Israel. And they helped create this nightmare of Islamophobia. They helped create refugee flows that we haven't seen since World War II, that have been like steroids for the far right in Europe, for literal Nazi-inspired parties in Europe. But these people are in the center. A lot of these people say that they're resisting Trump, but they really helped create the atmosphere in which Trump rose. And if it wasn't for 9/11, I think we'd be in a very different place politically. We forget, we never talk about 9/11. Look at the response to Ilhan Omar from her supposed defenders, from Nancy Pelosi. What did Pelosi say? 9/11 is sacred, and we need to start every conversation with reverence for 9/11. That means we can't talk about the origins of it. That means it's just a holy discussion, and we can't have historical context. And so that's why I think, that's what I tried to do with my book, is to put it into context. Part of the context, 15 of the 19 hijackers, where are they from? From the country where we have a special relationship with Saudi Arabia, a country with an official Wahhabi ideology. Those are the Muslims that our national security state prefers, not because they're moderate, but because they're useful. And the Muslims that they oppose are the ones that are able to have pluralistic states, previously stable states, states that are officially secular but allow people to practice their religion, whether they're Christian or Alawite or Muslim or Sunni or Shia. And those are the states that we've consistently broken down. And so now I think we're recovering. Those of us who understand that Palestine solidarity is not just about human rights, it's an anti-imperialist fight. We're recovering. Syria called on its allies and defeated this regime change operation. And now we're witnessing the US move closer to its own borders, although and we constantly hear that it's in the US's backyard, and embrace what John Bolton calls a Monroeist foreign policy, and tried to bring down the government in Venezuela, which happens to be a country that in 2007 expelled the Israeli ambassador in solidarity with Palestinians. I was just in Caracas this February. Anya was with me there, and we went to the International People's Assembly, which was a gathering of like 1,000 youth from around the world in Caracas to organize and get together and share ideas. And the vice president of Venezuela addressed us. And she gets on stage and she is wearing a kufiya to symbolize the centrality of Palestine and the importance of Palestine to that Bolivarian government in Venezuela. And then we saw several weeks later their foreign minister, Jorge Ariasa, visit Syria and Lebanon, and in Beirut deliver a press conference with a kufiya on to symbolize his solidarity with the Palestinian refugees of Beirut who want to go home. And so I don't think that's the key reason why this government's under attack. Again, it's like the Golan Heights, they have oil under their soil. But this is an issue. And so we need to be aware of which countries are under attack and how this fits into the Palestine equation. Because these are the countries that support Palestine at the UN. Nicaragua as well, also under attack. These are the countries that speak out for Palestine. These are the countries that put pressure on the Israeli embassy. And these are also the countries that are resisting US empire, which is the benefactor, the big daddy of Israel. And again, without those just spare parts for F-15s, just without a little bit of diplomatic support, the shark stops moving forward. So in order to keep the shark, to slow the shark down, we need to think not just about human rights, which is important. We need to think about empire. We need to think about what's happening in the world. And I'm very encouraged by what's happening in Venezuela because this government has also called on its allies and has managed to stop a coup attempt that the Trump administration put into motion. It's fighting a full-on embargo of its entire economy, another siege, and in many ways it's calling on supporters from the outside to do as Mahmoud Darwish called on all of us to do, which is to besiege the besieger. Whether with our words, our journalism, our poetry, our protests, our pressure on Congress, our running for elections and local elections, diplomatic pressure, whatever we can do, our job is to besiege the besieger, and this siege is a global one. It's by this is an imperial siege with Palestine at the center. Again, I really I put a lot of these ideas into my book. and tried to create this historical narrative to help people understand it in a different way. And Israel is always at the center. I always find Israel there, even though the book is not necessarily about Israel. So pick up a copy, but anyway, thanks for having me here. And you know, I don't know if there's time for Q&A, but I'll look forward to talking to you afterwards. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Max, for this excellent presentation, and I hope when we open the floor for discussion, you will be able to shed light on the question of why is it that Mr. Netanyahu is not making peace when his predecessors, including those from the Likud party, made peace with Israel, Labour made peace with Jordan. In fact, Israel made peace, partial peace with the Palestinians in Oslo, but during the discussion. But first, let me invite Mr. Mohammed for his remarks. Mr. Mohammed is the director of the Palestine Center.
Thank you all for coming here. Dr. Subhi, thank you. Thank you to ALHEWAR. Thank you, of course, to Max as well. So I wanted to touch more on the Israel issue, just because, Max discussed, he mentioned his friend and former colleague, David Sheen. David Sheen, we had him a couple of weeks ago at the Palestine Center. So he's also, like Max, a great independent journalist. And so in his presentation, he shed light a lot about Israeli society, so Israeli political parties, but really it was also very revealing about Israeli, the Israeli public itself. So he talked about how he was basing his research on a 2017 it was a poll done by a Hebrew university. So this is not a Palestinian poll. This is not an American poll. This is something done by Hebrew University, and this was numbers basing the attitudes of Jewish Israelis in Israel. And so he basically, what he does is he takes these numbers and he classifies Israelis and their political parties into, he created an acronym for easy classification. SIDE, which is segregation, which is a two-state solution, the people that support a two-state solution. Integration, which is the people that support a one democratic state where everybody's equal. Domination, which is a one apartheid state. And then elimination, which is one, not just an apartheid state, but a state where it's ethnically cleansed of Palestinians. So at first, from the numbers, from the polling numbers, it would seem that Jewish Israelis, 45% of them support a two-state solution. But then he looks closer at this, and then after they ask them more and more questions, so if they ask the people, okay, so 45% of them believe in a two-state solution. Okay, so if you ask them, do you support Palestinian sovereignty over their air, land, and water with so-called Israeli warning systems for 15 years, that support drops to 35%. Then if you ask them, okay, but Israel will also annex the settlement blocks, but they will evacuate all other settlements, the support drops again. Then you tell them, okay, Palestinians will receive territories similar in size to the annexed settlements, support drops some more. You tell them East Jerusalem will be the capital of the Palestinian state, support drops again. You tell them Haram al-Sharif will be under Palestinian sovereignty, it keeps going down. You allow the return of 100,000 100,000 Palestinian refugees, which is a fraction of what originally left in 1948, and then the others would be compensated, drops again. So after you ask them all these questions, support for such a two-state solution with these conditions goes to 20%. So it tells you a lot about the Israeli public themselves. And this is already a huge compromise for Palestinians who've given up a lot since 1948. So even with all of these major compromises, they're giving up a lot. They're going to get the better end of the deal, and they still refuse to support such a compromise. What's even worse, if you ask them, okay, so let's say, we all know nowadays it's kind of understood that the two-state solution is not even possible because of the fact, with all the settlements, it's just unrealistic. So you ask them, okay, let's ask Israeli Jews, what do you prefer, a democratic state or an apartheid state? And only 1/4 of Israeli Jews prefer the democratic state. 2/3 prefer an apartheid or ethnically cleansed state. So that tells you a lot about their attitudes. It does not look good at all. Max was mentioning how a lot of Jewish Israelis, it's just a racist society, and it's not getting better. And these numbers is from 2017. This is not from 20 years ago. So it says a lot. He also talked about the labor camp, which is also very telling, because you look at the labor camp, and they're actually, David Sheen, he classifies them under the so-called the domination camp, which is the apartheid state. And then you say, well, how? Because the labor camp is considered left-wing. They say, oh, these are leftist Israelis. Well, the labor camp is the one that, as David Sheen mentioned, they're the ones who perpetuated the Nakba in 1948. They're the ones responsible for that. They're the ones that conquered the West Bank. They conquered the Sinai Peninsula. They conquered the Golan Heights in 1967. They're the ones who sponsored the settlement movement. Shimon Peres, who was a big Labor Party guy, he gave support for the settlements. So you can't consider the Labor Party to be a supporter of the two-state solution. They might be leftist in name, but that's about it. Another thing is, in 2016, Israel's comptroller said, and he's the one that he said about Israel's state-sponsored education system, he said this: the state of Israel is doing very little to purge the severe phenomena of racism and hatred among youth. Over the years, the Ministry of Education has avoided taking the necessary steps for prevention of racism. In 2018, this was just last year, the Israeli Ministry of Education gave a Lifetime Achievement Award to this guy named Moshe Zar. This guy, he was implicated. I think he didn't serve a prison sentence, but he was implicated in a bombing campaign of Palestinian mayors in the West Bank. When he accepted, they gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award. When he accepted this award, he said, I am known for saying, build a house, it's like you wiped out 100 Arabs. Build a settlement, it's like you wiped out tens of thousands of Gentiles. That's the truth. That's what he said. And as David mentioned, nobody was in, they were not, they were not like David is the
Speaker at the Palestinian.
Yeah, he was the speaker. These people were not like, why would you say that? They were standing and clapping. They were happy about this. This is the Israeli Ministry of Education. So, when you have people, and then Max mentioned that the Temple movement, their chief rabbi, Israel Ariel, he said, we will conquer Iraq, Turkey. We will get to Iran too. The mosques and the Christian spires and their crosses come down. If not, you kill all of their males by sword. You only leave the woman. And this guy was Kahana's deputy, and as David Sheen mentions, he gets standing ovations in the Knesset. So this is the kind of people, I mean, this is not like a tiny fraction of people that are supporting him. When you're getting supported in the Knesset, you're getting standing ovations in the Knesset, it tells you a lot about, and it goes back to why Benjamin Netanyahu won this election. It's not just politics, but it's a reflection of the actual society, frankly. I wish that was not the case, but it really is. So it tells you a lot, and I think change will come not from Israeli Jews within Israel. It will come from people like Max, Jewish Americans here who speak up, because with these statistics, it does not look good. So that's kind of my assessment. And like he mentioned about Gantz said that many of Israelis' settlements will remain forever. He said that. He said that they will never withdraw from the Julan. And this is somebody that has been labeled as a left-wing guy. So you can't expect change from people like that. Anyway, I think I've spoken enough, so I think we should leave it to a discussion now. But again, thank you all, and thank you, Max. It was great.
And please be as brief as you can in your question or comment, because I would like to accommodate as many of you as possible. Let's start you.
A woman first.
Go ahead.
Okay, I yield.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Blumenthal, for a wonderful lecture. Absolutely fabulous information. I've always been fascinated by the Project for the New American Century, the Clean Break, in an eerie way. It seems to me that the backers of that white paper have come back to life, and that all roads do lead to Israel. If you read the Clean Break, they talk about clearly the support of Israel and the strategy for influencing the Middle East. So could you speak to how, like, it's shocking to me that they proposed the invasion of Iraq long before 9/11, and that the invasion of Iraq was a complete failure, and yet John Bolton is our national security advisor. Like, in what realm, like, how do you analyze the situation now where these people are coming back to life?
Great question. And sorry, Saeed, but I watch you at all the State Department briefings, and I've always wanted to get a question from you. So, I promise I won't be as incompetent as what's this new guy they have parking. What's his name?
Palladino.
Pellegrino.
Not Pellegrini.
San Palladino. Robert Palladino, yeah.
Right.
It's like a used car salesman. It's great. I mean, I love these guys. Anyway, Heather Nauert, she was great. Fox News personality replaced by the used car salesman. She was at least smart enough not to go to the UN. Okay, to your question, and I'm going to try to tie it into you because you had a question about why doesn't Bibi, feel the need to make peace as other fluid prime ministers had. And I mean, we're talking here about Camp David. 1979. Why did Camp David happen? It happened because of the 73 war. Sadat had a strategy. He threw, and it was a brilliant short-term strategy, very, cynical in a way, but also very militarily brilliant. And most of you probably know the history better than I do, so I don't even know why I'm bothering. But anyway, he throws out the Soviet advisors. He embarks on a secret plan to do the Great Crossing, to cross into the Suez into the Sinai. They get the wire-guided missiles from the Soviets, and he sends the chirti-birti, the infantry, the conscripts out. They've been trained in the use of these wire-guided missiles, and then the Israeli tanks come charging full speed ahead, underestimating what was about to happen, and they get hit one after another, and entire Israeli tank brigades are wiped out. And then they mounted a pincher attack on Israel, slowly invading, coming in, making Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, I was like the guy with the eye patch, that sociopath guy, feel like actually Tel Aviv was going to be taken and Israel's going to fall. All hell broke loose. Israel's existential crisis seemed like it was going to be realized, but, and some of you can correct me, it seemed like Sadat had a plan to sell out the Syrians. And he wanted to be the only one at the negotiating table. And that's what wound up happening. The Syrians failed to hold the Golan. Egypt sold them out there. And they negotiated the Camp David Accords, which removed...
Here's what I found on the web for Undertale to hold the goal line.
Whenever I say Syria comes in. Hold the goal line. Well, they didn't hold the goal line. Egypt was once the leader of the Arab world under Nasser. It was the engine of resistance. It was an independent state. Egypt after Camp David no longer was that, and Saudi Arabia starts to emerge as not only this kind of U.S. vassal, but with all of its oil wealth as the leader. And that dooms the Palestinians. There's actually a cable that was passed on to me from Edmund Fuller, who was the CIA station chief in Egypt, and it's about the aftermath of Camp David, and he's complaining to the U.S. Embassy that there was this plan for autonomy for the Palestinians put into Camp David, and they seem to have no desire to implement it. And it's because there was no resistance anymore to bring them to the table. Unfortunately, when Israel says that the Arabs only understand force, it's a projection, and that they only understand force, and the only time they've been forced to negotiate anything, whether it was the Camp David or the withdrawal or the disengagement from Gaza, it was because of force. And so Netanyahu doesn't feel enough force right now, or really there isn't much resistance going on, particularly in the West Bank. So why would he feel the need to negotiate anything? And then he has a public that is overrun with a settler colonial fever. So this goes to the Project for a New American Century question. When that document was introduced, it was at a time of triumphalism. I think Netanyahu has a triumphalist mood surrounding him. He believes that Zionism has sort of won and he can take anything he wants. And there was a triumphalism in the United States over winning the Cold War. They thought they'd won the Cold War. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, a check on U.S. empire was removed. Deterrence capacity of the countries that were supported by the Soviet Union was removed, and the U.S. thought, well, we can just go in and take them out one by one through pure force. The authors of the Project for a New American Century, the main authors, were two of the main neocons in Washington, Robert Kagan and William Kristol, figures who have bipartisan currency now, as you mentioned. And they, at the time, were out of work. They were at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, which is like where all the neocons go to cool their heels when a Democrat comes into power. So this was their plan for when they could get back into power. And Robert Kagan complemented it with an essay co-authored by Kristol in Foreign Affairs, which is the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, called Towards a Benevolent Hegemony. Towards Benevolent Hegemony. The U.S. would basically take over the world and be a benevolent dictator to the rest of the world. And how did they do that? Well, the details are in the Clean Break document, which I talked about before, where they really get into how the countries in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, and then the big prize in Iran will be collapsed. And so the reason that they wrote that document, and who wrote that document, it was Douglas Feith and Richard Pearl, who later went into the Bush administration and began cooking the intelligence. Saddam's connected to Al-Qaeda and WMDs and all that. They wrote it to emphasize Israel's value to Washington, that we can do this for you, because you want these states gone too, because you have this other document about benevolent hegemony, and these states are in the way. And so Iraq was the big test case. 9/11 happened, and first thing that Cheney starts talking about is Iraq, because they've all had these white papers put before, they have this agenda. So these figures, you're right. I mean, look at what happened in Iraq. Million dead, just complete catastrophe, the rise of ISIS, the terror attacks across the West as a result of the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, it's just complete chaos. And Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol paid no price for this in Washington at all. I say, in Washington it's where you get kicked upstairs. Like if you do something wrong in your foreign policy elite, you get a fellowship. You're like a senior fellow. Like the neocons have more senior fellows than the AARP. They're like always getting fellowships. It's like there's this financial feeding tube for them because there's all these billionaires that back them, the arms industry backs them, and the Republicans themselves don't have foreign policy know-how and they need advisors. So Trump comes in, he doesn't have any foreign policy know-how. He has very little experience. And then you look in the Congress at the freshman Republicans, these guys are like, they sell like used cars in pools in Texas. They don't know very much about the world. So then there's all these advisors just waiting to help them. Whether it's Robert Kagan, who advised Mitt Romney and Hillary Clinton, and did a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton actually in 2016, or William Kristol, who has this whole network and all of these funders, and is just ready to provide you with the papers on what to do. What is the consensus? The thing about Trump that's interesting here, and I'll try to wrap this up, but what was interesting is that Trump violated the consensus. He initially violated the neocon consensus, and this is in the afterword of my book. I talk about the 2016 campaign when Trump comes out and says, the Bush family failed to keep us safe on 9/11, and Iraq was a disaster, and we should have never gone there, and I feel so bad for all the young men that have come back here without arms and legs. And he started winning, and he attacked John McCain, one of the biggest warmongers in Congress, and everyone said, he's done. He called McCain a coward. He went up in the polls because the American people are sick of permanent war, and Trump understood that. So how can you domesticate Trump and get people like John Bolton in as his national security advisor? Well, it starts with William Kristol helping to gin up the Russiagate conspiracy, that Trump colluded with Russia. And then they removed Michael Flynn, his first national security advisor. How'd they do that? He was making a phone call with the Russian ambassador that was picked up on cables. He was in the Cayman Islands or in some foreign country. And he was probably, it was half past cocktail hour. He was stupid. He talks to the Russian ambassador. The NSA picks it up and they leak it. And they say that Flynn, the national security advisor, is having secret calls with the Russian ambassador. Collusion. What were they talking about? And someone can say what country they were talking about. Israel.
Yeah.
It was Israel Gate, because Jared Kushner, on behalf of Netanyahu, had asked Flynn to beg Russia to veto the UN resolution condemning Israel for settlement activity, because the U.S. was going to abstain under Obama as one last insult to Netanyahu. So Flynn's gone. Then you get H.R. McMaster, who's one of Petraeus's boy. He's in with the neocons in Washington. He's a counterinsurgency guy. He starts leaking on Trump, trying to embarrass Trump on Russia, and it's a way of pushing Trump even further and further into the neocon camp, preventing détente with Russia, preventing them from talking about ballistic missile treaties, preventing Trump from having his summit in Korea. That's the whole agenda. McMaster gets fired by Trump because he wouldn't stop leaking on him. And Trump, what does he do all day? He has executive time, that's what they call it. He basically eats McDonald's and watches Fox News and doesn't do anything else. So who does he see on Fox News? Who is the big Fox foreign policy contributor? John Bolton. And so he's like, I like that guy, just bring him in here, he seems loyal. And Bolton proceeds to destroy the Korea summit. He sabotages Trump's attempt to pull all the troops out of Syria. And he's driving the regime change agenda in Venezuela. And so the neocons are back. And Bill Kristol in posing as the leader of the anti-Trump resistance, was actually mobilizing inside his people to domesticate Trump and get to this moment where Trump went back on all of his campaign promises to be a non-interventionist. And so here we are, another campaign. Let's look at the candidates. Let's look at who is most likely to speak to the American public's desire to end permanent war and reinvest this money back home, and who will stand up to the national security state, that permanent class that some call the deep state. The person that I think would be the firmest against this element is the one who's spoken out most strongly against it, and it's Tulsi Gabbard. Unfortunately, I don't think she's going to be even allowed in the first tier of debates. Her name recognition won't get that far, but she will be able to apply pressure on Bernie Sanders. And so I think we're in an interesting moment where we're going to see the neocons try something else on Bernie. I think they're going to use Russiagate against Bernie. And so we need to be prepared for that. And, you know, and the Israel lobby will go full on against Bernie because he's violated the consensus. We had Saeed.
Oh, okay. Well, tell you what, you covered just about anything I could possibly ask about. A very quick question on a point that you did not mention, the deal of the century. Are we going to have one on June 6th, or are we not going to have one? Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead, sir.
Despite the grand ambition of the Crystal mob, there's a Keystone Cops element to the execution. And that brings to mind the Andrew Basovich line about they've constantly revealed the limits of American power, not the extent of it. So where do you see that? I mean, does buffoonery win at the end of the day, or does it fail?
Great question, and we have one here.
Kushner announced today that the details of the century, deal of the century, will be announced after Ramadan, which is like in 6 weeks. Under what circumstances the American administration will be able to pass this deal to be accepted by the Arabs and the Palestinians?
On the deal of the century, I mean, I would assume you'd have a better answer than me, but I've stopped paying attention to it because it just seems so implausible. And one of the biggest blows to the deal was because this is really the Kushner strategy for the Middle East. It's the new clean break because we know that Kushner, when he was a kid, Netanyahu literally slept in his bed.
Yeah.
He was literally in bed with Netanyahu. Well, they had Kushner sleep on the couch downstairs. But Netanyahu, and he was, younger, and he was like an opposition leader, would come to the Kushner family house and stay in Jared's bed. I mean, so basically everything Jared Kushner does is as, the proxy of Netanyahu. And they've come up with this deal, and part of the deal was that Saudi Arabia would fund it, right? They'd put up the money to basically pay off the most, bought-off Palestinian leadership they could find. And then, Jamal Khashoggi walks into a consulate in Istanbul, and everything goes to pieces, so to speak. Because Mohammed bin Salman becomes suddenly persona non grata in Washington. Lindsey Graham calls for the removal of Mohammed bin Salman. And, I hear from people who talk to, people in national security circles, they really consider MBS to be like the new Saddam, someone who's they thought Saddam would be their ally against Iraq, but he was just too erratic, too crazy, too full of himself. Also, maybe a little bit too independent. MBS has made entreaties towards China. The U.S. doesn't like that. So it's difficult to see getting something through Congress that would put Saudi Arabia at the center, but it's also impossible when you actually look at the deal. It's such a sellout of even the Palestinian Authority that it basically ends any sovereignty for them, even in Area A. I don't know what the point of them is, and it could put great pressure on Jordan. You could see massive instability in Jordan. It is a pretext for annexation, and this is actually a no-go with the Democrats in Congress who favor officially a two-state solution. I also would point to, in Congress, the influence of J Street on the Democrats, which is considerable, and they would reject this. So I just don't see it happening. If either of you have if either of you do think it will happen, or Mohammed, if you have any comments on it.
So that's actually, so I know Saeed, I know Al-Quds had a report back in February about a prediction of what it would be, right? But recently I was reading a report from that was authored by Daniel Pipes, which is not necessarily
Project
a great.
for the New American Century, Daniel Pipes.
Yeah, he's not the great source that we expect. But anyway, his claim is that Palestine or Palestinian autonomy would consist of areas A and B in the West Bank and parts of Area C. You know, depends. The capital would be near Jerusalem or its boundaries. There would be an international body that oversees a joint PA and Israeli administration governing Jerusalem's holy basin, the Old City. A joint PA Jordan body would control the Islamic sanctuaries. Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon would give more rights to their Palestinian residents, which would probably be related to some kind of monetary, as they've said, the bribe of the century. Jewish residents in smaller West Bank settlements would be relocated. A land passage that would connect the West Bank and Gaza. And then, you know, Washington would organize a big economic aid package for the PA and you know, anybody else involved. Frankly, I don't know how realistic that is, but
I guess my question, if I just may,
Reframe
is it something that we're going to see, or is it something that the administration keeps dangling, you know, keeps talking about just to talk about it, and actually we will not see?
It's hard to say with this erratic administration. I would make a quick point about Pipes, which is that he's always traveling to the UAE, and I think he speaks Arabic.
he does. Yeah, he does.
And
yeah.
he's always talking about how the UAE is a force for good. And, you know, it's interesting when one of these, just the mega Islamophobe is making those statements, but I would consider him to be a fairly reliable source on what the contents are, because the UAE is strongly behind the deal of the century, or the bribe of the century, as you said. But your question was, remind me again.
You know, I'm saying, is it something that is going to be revealed actually and come out like a plan and declared, as they said, you know, today, green flag?
Yeah.
He said that we're going to reveal it, you know, right after that, or he endorsed the article.
I think they're using
But is it something that, you know, something that you just keep, you know, it's like a little dog that keeps following, you know, the bait kind of a thing? Is it something that we're going to see, or something that will continue to be deferred?
It's of a part with Kushner's attempts to, you know, cut funding of UNRWA, to really turn up the heat anywhere he can, and essentially sanction one of the most vulnerable societies on earth until it comes to the table on the deal of the century. And I think that's part of what the rhetoric of annexation is about. Netanyahu has promised to annex parts of the West Bank when he comes in, and they'll say, you know, you can negotiate the deal of the century, or we'll just take it ourselves. But I think that no matter what happens, we will see Area C basically become the settlers, belong to the settlers, and we are in a one-state reality. No matter how much you slice it, it's a single apartheid state. Quickly on the limits of American power, and this deal of the century does also demonstrate that. The U.S. has a lot more power within areas that Israel occupies than it does outside, which is why we also see them just say, hey, the Golan Heights, I'm giving it to Israel, because it's kind of one of the few victories Trump can claim. And of course, when he announces it, he goes to the Republican Jewish coalition and refers to Israel before a crowd of American Jews as your country and Netanyahu as your prime minister. This is Sheldon Adelson's group. Sheldon Adelson actually sees it that way himself. But you know, Venezuela demonstrates the limits of American power. This is, you know, one of the most open coup that I've ever seen, and probably we've ever seen. There was no attempt to just say, oh, it's a color revolution, the people are rising up against the dictator. The people weren't rising up. Nothing was happening in the streets. And the U.S. just goes and declares that this guy that no one had ever heard of before, Juan Guaido, they kept calling Juan Guido because they'd never heard of him, like they're using like some like Italian slur for him. 1 out of 5 Venezuelans had only heard of him before. He ruled like he was elected in one of the least populous states in the country. He was a complete nobody, but he kind of looked like Obama, so I guess they chose him. And he was just declared the interim president. And then Wikipedia said interim president. And CNN said interim president. And now CNN's saying self-declared president. They're changing his title. They're demoting him. Opposition leader. They're getting demoted even further. And now it's like, you know, that game, Where's Waldo? It's like, where's Guaido? Like, you don't even know where he is. Nothing's happening. So everybody's, you know, the IMF the board members of the IMF just voted to not recognize Guaido because they actually have to deal with the government that controls actual institutions. I'll give you another anecdote of how boneheaded the Trump administration is. The former intelligence chief of Hugo Chavez, Hugo Carvajal, was actually flipped to the U.S. side. They had threatened to prosecute him for drug trafficking, and they flipped him in 2017 and basically made him a U.S. asset. And as the coup heated up, he went to the New York Times and they were like, tell all the dirty secrets you know about the Chavistas because you were on the inside. And he went, and the New York Times had a big, you know, spread on the front page. Chavez's former intelligence chief tells all. He's doing everything he can for the U.S., you know, short of giving Donald Trump a sponge bath. And last week, the United States calls for the extradition of Hugo Carvajal and his arrest and prosecution for drug trafficking after he did all that for them. And this is at a time when they're calling for the Venezuelan military to defect to their side and promising amnesty. And everybody's looking at this and they're like, no, I'm not gonna risk that. I'm not gonna do it. You know, I smoked a joint 5 years ago and I didn't inhale, but they'll try me for drug trafficking. So they're just so boneheaded in the way they're going about this. And at the same time, they're doing a lot of damage to average people. It's another point I wanted to make. The U.S. is using sanctions in place of straight up conventional warfare. They're using it as a form of war against Iran, and people are suffering greatly there. In Syria right now, you know, luckily it's warming up there, but through the winter they faced a heating crisis, and there are lines at gas stations because the U.S. is sanctioning their gas and oil and heating supplies themselves. Actually, the leader of the White Helmets riot, Saleh, came to Washington in 2016 to lobby for the first round of those sanctions. What a humanitarian lifesaver. And they're being honored at the Holocaust Memorial Museum this month, a museum that has Elliot Abrams on its board. So a lot of funny things going on. So sanctions are doing great damage now in Venezuela. They're beginning to affect ordinary people. The government has a food distribution program called CLAP, where they can get boxes of basically free food products and sanitary supplies. It's helped keeping people alive in amidst an economic crisis. And we just heard from a friend that it didn't, this month for the first time in a while, it didn't have cooking oil. It didn't have certain basic items, and people fear that the sanctions are starting to kick in. So we need to talk about sanctions as a form of war and oppose it, and see Gaza, the Gaza Strip and the siege of Gaza as the ultimate kind of the most severe example of sanctioning. Finally, go ahead.
Interrupt. Everybody here that hasn't seen Killing Gaza, which is the film that Max and Dan Cohen produced, you can watch it online. Just go to what is it?
KillingGaza.com. It's like $3 to rent.
It's one of the most powerful films that you can. It's a documentary film. Go there, check it out, because it really will make you. It'll put you to tears. Let's put it that way.
And just last quick comment, on the 24th, Juan Guaido's gang is going to try to seize the Venezuelan embassy by force in Washington with a Secret Service escort. And so if you can be there, the embassy staff is welcoming protesters and people who want to stand up to this flagrant violation of international law and piracy.
Now, you still have to answer Mr. Shinawi's question, but because we are running out of time, I would like to take 2 more questions from Dr. Dawood and from the lady, and let's start with you, and then you will have to answer 3 of them.
It is not surprising that Israel, a state that you label as apartheid state be created there. There is no historic reason, legal, moral, and it seems that the only justification is the shark mentality that you have described ably, I think, the Zionist culture, Zionist impetus. Consequently, it's not surprising that when this shark mentality could get us to establish a state and replace a whole people in an environment with lots of weakness, we will continue going on. Now, knowing what we know about the power and the influence of the Zionist organization over the Trumps and the neocons, the John Boltons and others in this nation and internationally, I would be quite interested in knowing your perception. You apparently have a good insight about the Israeli society. How do they feel about Palestinians getting armed when you have your back to the wall and starting armed resistance, Lebanese doing the same, and the spread, the propagation of a culture of resistance in the area? Are they aware of this, and how do they react to this?
About 30 years ago, there was a movement, I think you mentioned it, Peace Now. It was rather promising. I was really following their activities at that time. Then we hear about them less and less. So what is their situation? Also, what is the situation of the Communist Party in Israel? Thank you.
Anybody else? We have only 5 minutes left.
For the answer, I think.
Over there, in the back, please go ahead.
Yeah, the question I was looking for, it's a fairly pessimistic view, unfortunately, but that's, I think, reality. I was looking for some,
Hope.
path of hope or something, and you're talking about BDS sort of slowing down the shark. That seemed like, that was one positive notion, but the image that conjured in my own mind is that I've never seen a dying shark just float away, that it usually starts thrashing violently, and that's going to cause a lot of pain and misery, for a lot of people. So is there any sort of a path forward?
And your question
Yes.
on the ultimate, on the final, what do they call it, the final solution? Or the deal of the century, sorry. Sorry, I got confused.
Under what circumstances the U.S. would be able to sell this deal to the Arabs?
Right, okay. I would just, not without a definitive answer. The Arab League had a meeting, I think 2 weeks ago, and it was really depressing. The U.S., under the control of the U.S., they kept Syria out, even though you can tell that many of the Arab states, even the UAE, want to resume normal relations with Syria. So, the Arab League has been neutered. It functions a lot like the Organization of American States, the OAS. It's just an arm of U.S. control. And so as far as selling the deal of the century, it's done through IMF loans, it's done through various threats and all kinds of games the U.S. can play through its embassy. Countries like Tunisia are in a very precarious situation economically since the Arab Spring or the so-called Arab Spring, and they're very weak. So I think this deal is, they tend to impose this deal, but at the same time it's just such a bad deal that even Abbas can't accept it. And this, I guess, goes to your question about the culture of resistance, which has been sort of worn down over time, but it's still present. And when it's in the Gaza Strip, people in the Gaza Strip, when I go there, you think they're going to be so sad and they're going to be all miserable about being under siege, but they actually have a much prouder sensibility than people I meet in the West Bank or inside Israel who are Palestinian citizens. They're proud that there are not Israelis among them. They're proud that they held on to their weapons and their culture of resistance is still active. And as you asked how Jewish Israelis understand that, they understand it just purely as terrorism. They do not, and they're educated to see it as such. There's a really important study of Israeli textbooks by Nurit Peled El-Hanan that shows how Jewish Israeli school kids are educated, and when they see an Arab in these school books or a Palestinian, they're either seen as like a falahi, like a farmer, or as a terrorist. Usually the former, or they're not seen at all. And they're not seen as people, intellectuals or doctors or anything. So I would also say, however, that people in Israel's military intelligence apparatus, they recognize the culture of resistance as a real threat, and they understand the motivations behind it. They have to, in order to get what they want. And so when Ehud Barak was asked, what would you do if you were a Palestinian? He said, I would pick up a gun and be a guerrilla fighter. And those were the words of Israel's most decorated veteran. So the disappearance of resistance, I think, has given, or at least the weakening of resistance has given Netanyahu, as I said, a free hand. And it has also actually harmed the peace camp, which you asked about, the so-called peace camp of Peace Now. So Peace Now's real fatal decision, why they don't exist anymore, is because, the contradiction of liberal Zionism eventually imploded or exploded through the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords set the stage for the separation principle, which means hard separation between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians in order to set the stage for a two-state solution that will be negotiated at some time, because Oslo had no final agreements and it didn't even have a real map. So what happens after Oslo is Rabin and his cabinet begin laying the first electrified fences and and concrete barriers around the frontiers of the Gaza Strip. And they begin doing the same thing on the path that would eventually become the separation wall, which was supported fervently by the Labor Party and supported by the board of Peace Now, because they said that, we just need to be separate. What's his name? Amos Oz, who is like their, poet laureate. He was the writer that the peace camp would gravitate around. He had a book called, I forget what it was called. It was called We Need a Divorce. And basically the divorce would entail hard separation. And what happened? They built the wall, they all supported it, and then the Palestinians disappear from Israeli life, and they're not able to come to protests in Jerusalem, for example. They're not able to put pressure on the Israeli government the way they used to, because they have been physically separated, and so the peace camp loses its ability to say, hey, here's these people, listen to them. And the wall isn't just, the separation wall. There's thousands of little walls in the West Bank where Israel can shut down an entire village. The village of Al-Walajeh is surrounded by walls. It's completely surrounded. Kalkilia, completely surrounded by walls, and it's losing its population because people can't live there anymore. And that, I think, was the death blow of the peace camp, and it ultimately set the stage not just for the siege of Gaza, the withdrawal of Gaza, which David Grossman and Amos Oz and all those people supported, but for the assault on Gaza in 2014. This is the legacy of Oslo. This is the legacy of the peace camp, and this is why no one listens to them anymore. Oh, and you asked about the Communist Party. I think they've gone the same way. Hadash is the Israeli Communist Party, and they supported a two-state solution and many of these same things. I'd also point out, I think PFLP supported Oslo, signed on to Oslo, because they were so weakened by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they entered a long period of irrelevance as a result. Hope. Yeah, you make a good point about the thrashing of the shark, and I think we're seeing it right now. The hope is here, not just in this room, but as Mohammed pointed out, there's this huge crisis among American Jews where you witness even the Birthright Israel program, which I went on, which was this free trip for Jewish Americans to go to Israel and party and hang out with Israeli soldiers. Their enrollment is way down, and they're actually having internal protests on the trips where young Jews actually go on these trips for the sole purpose of protesting them. When I was there, no one was talking about that. I went before the Second Intifada. So the Democratic primary, it's going to be a liability for a candidate like Pete Buttigieg or Buttigieg or whatever his name is to get up and say, I stand with Israel. He's going to pay a price among the grassroots for that. This is the first campaign like that. So there's a lot of hope because, again, we are the ones who feed the shark. We feed the shark, and so I think, and we are the majority. Look, one more point. I've noticed that the people calling me an anti-Semite aren't always Jewish anymore. They're often, Gentiles from Texas, your old neighbors. And that's because the real base of his pro-Israel support is among Christian Zionists now who are often older, and they believe that, I'm going to burn in an everlasting lake of fire because I'm not a born-again Christian. They even believe that Christians in Palestine will burn in that everlasting lake of fire because they're not born-again evangelicals. They want the apocalypse to come today. And so this is not really a constituency that you want to lean on. Bipartisan support is just pretty much over, and you're left with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer holding the line, but that's not a real reflection of where people are at right now. So I do think there is hope. I don't know where it goes. It's just a question of how we mobilize people, and we should avoid kind of dividing people within the movement on side issues.
May I just make a quick announcement very related to this subject? First of all, I escaped before they burned me as Christian Palestinian, so I'm here, I'm safe. Jafar Farah, who is the founder, director of Musawa in Haifa. Musawa is an important organization, works to gain the rights for Palestinians inside of Israel. He was supposed to be here in about 2 weeks. Unfortunately, his mother died yesterday. So otherwise, I was going to talk to Subhi, try to organize another forum for him. He'll be going on Capitol Hill and other places. But with your permission, Subhi, if he comes like 2 weeks after, in other words, a month from now, maybe we can invite him here as a speaker.
Consider Ramadan now, it's hard to do any event.
We won't present any food. We just
nothing about
half,
food.
no.
About the time of the event, the date, the evening, doesn't fit with Ramadan.
Present the part. Okay. But if he comes after Ramadan.
Okay, before we conclude, I wish we had more time for more questions and comments, but maybe in the near future, we get together again. Before I give you the 3 program notes, I would like to urge you by getting the subscription coupons, which I believe are over there on the table. My 3 program notes is, number 1, next Wednesday we will have a great discussion online. Next Wednesday, a great discussion. Why a great discussion? Because the guest speaker is the granddaughter of the prominent Algerian leader Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi. She will be talking about freedom in Algeria from the era of her grandfather to the popular movement of today. So that's next Wednesday. Program note number 2, on June 27th, that's after the end of Ramadan, كل سنة وانتم طيبين, on Thursday, that would be Thursday. So the monthly meeting will move from Wednesdays to Thursdays. And the first one will be on June 27th. We will hear from Dr. Farid Yassin, the Iraqi ambassador in Washington, and he will be talking about, obviously, Iraq and regional developments. And the location for the monthly meeting, so it will move from Wednesday to Thursday, and the location will also move to the Vienna Community Center. And the final program note is that please I encourage you to join ALHEWAR Center on Twitter. So finally, ALHEWAR Center will be limited to 140 alphabets only.
No, it's 280 now.
At the end, 180 now, okay, expanded. I would like to thank our distinguished guests, Mohammed and Max Blumenthal. Thank you very much.